Sometimes the most powerful stories begin with a single moment of silence. Picture this, a room full of America's most elite warriors suddenly going quiet, their laughter dying in their throats as they realize they've just made the biggest mistake of their military careers. What started as casual mockery of an old man's faded tattoo would end with grown soldiers standing at attention, some with tears in their eyes, as they learned the true meaning of sacrifice and honor. This isn't just another military story. This is about judgment, redemption, and the dangerous assumption that we can measure a person's worth by what we see on the surface. It's about how one weathered tattoo carried more history than an entire library of war stories, and how a general's revelation would forever change how these soldiers viewed courage, service, and the quiet heroes walking among us. What you're about to read will make you question everything you think you know about heroism, and remind you that sometimes the most extraordinary stories belong to the most ordinary-looking people. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his worn baseball cap and walked through the gates of one of America's most prestigious military installations. At 72 years old, his weathered hands showed the calluses of decades spent working construction after his military service ended. His clothes were simple, clean but clearly from discount stores, and his walking pace was deliberate, careful, the gait of a man whose body had endured more than most people could imagine. Thomas wasn't supposed to be here. He had received an invitation, somewhat reluctantly extended by his nephew, Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, to attend a special ceremony honoring long-serving military families. James had been hesitant to invite his uncle, not out of shame, but because he knew how uncomfortable Thomas felt in formal military settings these days. The old man had served his time, done his duty, and preferred the quiet anonymity of civilian life. But Thomas's granddaughter, Sarah, had convinced him to go. She was graduating from West Point in 3 months and wanted her grandfather to start reconnecting with his military heritage. Sarah had grown up hearing whispered fragments of stories about her grandfather's service, but Thomas never spoke about his time in the military. When pressed, he would simply say he did his job and came home, which was more than many could say. The ceremony was being held in the Delta Force compound, an honor that spoke to Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's distinguished service record. As Thomas approached the main building, he could hear voices and laughter echoing from inside. Through the windows, he could see men and women in their prime, the kind of physical specimens that made military recruitment posters come to life. These were America's elite warriors, the tip of the spear, soldiers whose very presence commanded respect. Thomas paused at the entrance, his hand resting on the door handle. For a moment, he considered turning around and heading home. These weren't his people anymore, if they ever had been. He was just an old construction worker with dirt under his fingernails and a social security check that barely covered his rent. What business did he have among these modern warriors? But he had promised Sarah he would try to connect with this part of his past, even if it made him uncomfortable. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room fell into a brief lull as the older civilian entered. Several Delta Force operators glanced in his direction, their trained eyes automatically assessing this newcomer. Thomas looked exactly like what he was, an aging blue-collar worker who seemed out of place among the military's finest. His clothes, while clean, were clearly off-the-rack purchases from years past. His shoes were practical work boots, scuffed and resoled multiple times. Everything about him suggested a man who had worked with his hands his entire life and had little connection to the military world. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was the first to notice the tattoo. As Thomas removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves in the warm room, a faded piece of ink became visible on his right forearm. The tattoo was old, clearly done decades ago with inferior equipment and ink. Time had blurred its edges and faded its colors until it was barely recognizable. What had once been sharp lines and vibrant details had become a muddy, indistinct marking that looked more like a birthmark than intentional body art. "Check out Grandpa's prison ink," Rodriguez muttered to his teammate, Corporal Danny Walsh, nodding toward Thomas's arm. The comment was meant to be quiet, but in the acoustics of the room, it carried further than intended. Walsh grinned and took a closer look. "Damn, that thing looks like it was done with a ballpoint pen and a prayer. Probably got it in some back alley shop for $20. The comments began to spread through the group like ripples on a pond. These men were used to pristine military tattoos, artistic pieces that told clear stories or marked specific achievements. They wore their own ink with pride, each piece carefully chosen and professionally executed. To them, Thomas's faded tattoo represented everything unprofessional about civilian life, a sloppy marking that had no place among serious military personnel. "I bet it's some girl's name he regrets," suggested Sergeant First Class Tony Martinez, causing a round of quiet chuckles from the surrounding soldiers. "Or maybe it's supposed to be a skull, but the artist was legally blind," added Private First Class Jay Coleman, earning more laughs. Thomas heard the comments, but pretended not to. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when you were outnumbered and outranked by decades. He found a quiet corner of the room and settled into a folding chair, content to wait for the ceremony to begin and then slip away as quickly as possible. But the comments continued, growing bolder as more soldiers joined in. Someone suggested that the tattoo might be a map to buried treasure, but the artist had been too drunk to draw it correctly. Another joked that it looked like a children's drawing that someone had decided to make permanent. The laughter grew louder, and Thomas felt the familiar weight of being an outsider, of not belonging in a world he had once called home. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell entered the room and immediately sensed the atmosphere. He saw his uncle sitting alone in the corner, looking smaller somehow than he remembered. James felt a pang of regret about inviting Thomas. He loved his uncle, but he also understood how different their military experiences had been. James had risen through the ranks in the modern army, benefiting from better training, advanced technology, and clear career progression paths. His uncle's service had been in a different era, a more chaotic time when things were handled differently. "Uncle Tom," James approached with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm glad you could make it. How was the drive down?" Thomas stood and shook his nephew's hand. "It was fine, Jimmy. Nice place you've got here. Very impressive. These are good men," James said, glancing around the room at his soldiers. "The best our country has to offer. They work hard and deserve to blow off some steam." Thomas nodded, understanding the subtext. His nephew was asking him to overlook whatever comments he might have heard. It was easier for everyone if the old man just accepted his place as an outsider and didn't cause any waves. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, but the informal gathering was clearly the main event. These soldiers rarely had the opportunity to relax together, and they were making the most of it. Stories were being shared, achievements celebrated, and bonds strengthened through shared experience and mutual respect. But Thomas remained apart from it all, a reminder of a different kind of service, a different era of warfare. To these modern warriors, he represented the past, and not necessarily a past they wanted to claim. His faded tattoo became a symbol of everything they had evolved beyond, everything they had improved upon through better training, superior equipment, and more professional standards. As the comments about his tattoo continued, Thomas found himself thinking about the day he had gotten it. The memory was as clear as if it had happened yesterday, though more than 50 years had passed. He could still feel the sting of the needle, smell the antiseptic in the makeshift tattoo parlor, hear the sounds of helicopters overhead, and artillery in the distance. That tattoo had been more than just ink on skin. It had been a declaration, a promise, a bond that connected him to brothers who had not all made it home. But how could he explain that to these young soldiers? How could he make them understand that sometimes the most meaningful things look the least impressive from the outside? They saw only a faded, poorly executed piece of body art on an old civilian who didn't belong in their world. They couldn't see the story behind it, the sacrifice it represented, or the brotherhood it symbolized. Thomas checked his watch and wondered how much longer he would have to endure this. The ceremony would be brief, and then he could return to his quiet life where his past remained safely buried, and his service was just a distant memory that rarely troubled his daily routine. He had no way of knowing that in less than an hour, everything would change. The general would arrive, the ceremony would take an unexpected turn, and his carefully guarded secrets would be revealed in a way that would leave these elite soldiers questioning everything they thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of military service. For now, though, Thomas Mitchell was just an old man with a faded tattoo, sitting alone in a room full of warriors, counting the minutes until he could go home, and pretend this day had never happened. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in the room grew more relaxed, and with that relaxation came bolder commentary. The Delta Force operators had finished their initial assessment of the elderly civilian, and had largely dismissed him as irrelevant to their world. This dismissal gave them the freedom to speak more openly, treating Thomas as if he were invisible or too old to understand their modern military humor. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had positioned himself where he could keep an eye on Thomas's tattoo, and he began providing running commentary to his fellow soldiers. "I'm trying to figure out what that thing is supposed to be," he said, loud enough for several people to hear. "At first I thought it might be an eagle, but now I'm thinking it could be a really deformed butterfly." Corporal Walsh joined him in the speculation. "Maybe it's supposed to be some kind of military insignia, but the guy doing it had never actually seen one before. Like he was working from a description someone gave him over the phone." The laughter that followed was infectious, and soon more soldiers were craning their necks to get a better look at the mysterious tattoo. Thomas pretended to be absorbed in reading a pamphlet about base services, but he could feel their eyes on him, could hear every word of their commentary. "I've got it," announced Sergeant Martinez with the confidence of someone solving a difficult puzzle. "It's supposed to be a skull and crossbones, but the artist was working during an earthquake." This observation brought the loudest laughter yet, and several soldiers had to wipe tears from their eyes. The image of an elderly tattoo artist trying to work while the ground shook beneath him was apparently hilarious to these battle-hardened warriors. Private Coleman, emboldened by the group's reaction, decided to take the commentary a step further. "Hey, Grandpa," he called out directly to Thomas, abandoning all pretense of talking around him. "What's that supposed to be on your arm? Did you lose a bet or something?" Thomas looked up from his pamphlet, meeting Coleman's eyes with a steady gaze that held no anger, just a quiet dignity that came from decades of dealing with people who didn't understand his world. "It's just an old tattoo," he said simply. "Nothing special." This response only encouraged more questions. "Come on, there's got to be a story there," pressed Walsh. "Nobody gets a tattoo like that without some kind of story behind it. Was it your first girlfriend's name? Some kind of club you belonged to?" Thomas shook his head slightly. "Like I said, nothing special. Just something I got when I was young and foolish." The soldiers exchanged glances, interpreting his reluctance to elaborate as embarrassment about a youthful mistake. In their experience, people who were proud of their tattoos were eager to share their stories. Someone who deflected questions was usually hiding something embarrassing or trying to cover up a past they'd rather forget. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell watched this interaction with growing discomfort, but he found himself in a difficult position. These were his men, soldiers he trusted with his life on a regular basis. They weren't being malicious, just engaging in the kind of ribbing that was common in military culture. At the same time, Thomas was his uncle, a man he respected even if he didn't fully understand his reluctance to discuss his military service. "Maybe we should give my uncle some space," James suggested mildly, but his tone lacked the authority he would have used to shut down behavior he truly disapproved of. "We're not bothering him, are we, Pops?" Rodriguez asked Thomas directly, using a nickname that walked the line between friendly and condescending. "We're just curious about the artwork. No offense intended." Thomas nodded politely. None taken. But the conversation had drawn the attention of other soldiers in the room, and what had started as casual commentary from a few individuals was now becoming a group activity. Someone suggested that they should guess what the tattoo was supposed to represent, turning it into a game that would pass the time until the ceremony began. "I think it's supposed to be a flag," offered one soldier. "Like maybe a state flag, but from a state that doesn't exist anymore. Or maybe it's a coat of arms from some family that died out during the plague," suggested another, causing more laughter. The guesses became increasingly creative and ridiculous. Someone proposed that it might be a map of a fictional country from a fantasy novel. Another suggested it was a secret code that, when properly decoded, would reveal the location of Jimmy Hoffa's body. Each suggestion was met with laughter and applause, and the soldiers were clearly enjoying themselves. Thomas maintained his composure throughout this impromptu roasting session, but inside he was struggling with emotions he hadn't felt in decades. He had spent so much energy over the years building a life where his past didn't matter, where he could just be Tom Mitchell the construction worker, Tom Mitchell the quiet neighbor, Tom Mitchell the grandfather who showed up to school plays and birthday parties without any fanfare or expectation of special treatment. But sitting in this room, surrounded by the laughter and casual dismissal of these young warriors, he felt the weight of everything he had carried alone for so many years. The tattoo they were mocking represented the worst and best moments of his life, experiences that had shaped him in ways that still influenced his daily decisions half a century later. He thought about Bobby Hendricks, who had been 22 when he died in Thomas's arms, bleeding out from shrapnel wounds while enemy fire kept the medics pinned down. Bobby had been talking about his fiancée back home, making Thomas promise to tell her that his last thoughts were of their wedding plans. The tattoo had been Bobby's idea, something he and Thomas had gotten together during a rare moment of leave, a symbol of their brotherhood and their commitment to bringing each other home safely. He thought about Maria Santos, the only woman he had ever truly loved, who had waited for him through 2 tours in Vietnam only to die in a car accident 3 weeks before he returned stateside. She had sent him a letter describing the small ceremony she wanted when he returned, how she had already picked out her dress and reserved the church. The letter had reached him the same day he learned of her death, and he had never opened another letter from home after that. He thought about the mission that had earned him the tattoo's companion, a medal he had never claimed because the operation was classified, and the men who could verify his actions were all dead. He had spent 3 days behind enemy lines, carrying wounded soldiers to safety one by one, making trip after trip through hostile territory while enemy forces closed in around him. By the time rescue arrived, Thomas had saved 11 men and killed more enemies than he cared to remember. But how could he explain any of this to soldiers who saw him as nothing more than an old civilian with questionable taste in body art? How could he make them understand that the faded ink on his arm represented bonds forged in combat, promises made to dying friends, and sacrifices that had cost him everything he had ever wanted in life? The mockery continued, growing more elaborate as the soldiers fed off each other's creativity. Someone suggested that the tattoo might be a primitive attempt at abstract art, like something a caveman might have drawn if cavemen had access to tattoo equipment. Another proposed that it was actually a really advanced form of camouflage, designed to be so confusing that enemies would be distracted trying to figure out what they were looking at. Through it all, Thomas remained quiet, polite, and seemingly unbothered by the commentary. But Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was beginning to notice subtle signs of strain in his uncle's demeanor. The way he held his shoulders slightly too rigid. The careful control in his voice when he responded to direct questions. The way his eyes had gone distant, as if he was seeing something beyond the walls of the room. James found himself remembering fragments of conversations from his childhood, times when other family members had started to tell stories about Uncle Tom's military service only to be quickly hushed by the adults. There had always been an understanding that Thomas's time in the service was not a topic for casual discussion, but James had assumed this was because his uncle was modest about his achievements, not because there were deeper issues involved. Now, watching his uncle endure this mockery with such stoic dignity, James began to wonder if there were things about Thomas's service that he had never been told, experiences that explained why his uncle had never joined veterans organizations, never attended military reunions, and never spoke about his time in uniform except in the most general terms. The ceremony was still 15 minutes away, but James was beginning to hope it would start early. The longer this went on, the more uncomfortable he became with his soldiers' behavior, even though they weren't technically doing anything wrong. Military culture had always included a certain amount of good-natured ribbing, and civilian visitors to military installations were generally expected to accept that they were entering a different world with different rules. But there was something about the way his uncle was handling this situation that suggested he was drawing on reserves of patience and self-control that came from experiences far more serious than anything these modern soldiers had faced. There was a quality to Thomas's quiet dignity that spoke of someone who had endured far worse than mockery and had learned to find strength in places that most people never had to explore. As the laughter continued around him, Thomas closed his eyes for just a moment and allowed himself to remember not the pain and loss that the tattoo represented, but the brotherhood. He thought about the men who had shared that bond with him, who had understood without explanation what it meant to carry pieces of each other's souls in the form of permanent ink. He thought about promises kept and promises broken, about coming home when others didn't, and about the responsibility that came with being a survivor. In just a few more minutes, everything would change. The general would arrive, the ceremony would take an unexpected turn, and these young soldiers would learn that sometimes the most faded tattoos tell the most powerful stories. But, for now, Thomas Mitchell continued to sit quietly in his corner, enduring their laughter with the same grace he had shown in surviving everything else life had thrown at him. The sound of multiple vehicles approaching outside brought a temporary halt to the conversation in the room. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell glanced at his watch, frowning slightly. The ceremony wasn't scheduled to begin for another 10 minutes, and he wasn't expecting any additional VIPs beyond the base commander who was supposed to officiate the event. "That's a lot of engines," observed Sergeant Martinez, moving toward the window to investigate the commotion outside. What he saw made him straighten immediately. "Sir, we've got brass arriving. Serious brass. That's a general's convoy out there. The announcement sent a wave of activity through the room as soldiers quickly checked their uniforms and straightened their posture. Even in a relaxed setting, the unexpected arrival of high-ranking officers required immediate attention to military bearing and protocol. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell felt his stomach drop. Unscheduled visits from generals were rarely good news, especially when they came with multiple escort vehicles and what appeared to be a security detail. He quickly ran through a mental checklist of recent operations, personnel issues, and administrative matters, trying to anticipate what might have prompted such a high-level visit. Through the window, the soldiers watched as a small convoy of black SUVs arranged themselves in the parking area with military precision. Security personnel emerged first, taking positions that provided clear sight lines and escape routes. Then, the main vehicle's doors opened, revealing a figure that several of the more experienced soldiers recognized immediately. "Holy shit," whispered Corporal Walsh, then immediately caught himself and glanced around to make sure no officers had heard his outburst. "Sorry, sir, but that's General Patricia Hawkins." The name sent a ripple of recognition through the room. General Hawkins was a legend in special operations circles, a combat veteran whose career had spanned multiple conflicts, and whose reputation for toughness was matched only by her reputation for absolute integrity. She was known for her direct communication style, her unwavering standards, and her ability to see through any kind of military bureaucratic nonsense. More importantly, she was known for not making social calls. If General Hawkins was here, there was a specific reason, and that reason was unlikely to be pleasant for everyone involved. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell quickly moved toward the door, mentally preparing himself for whatever was about to unfold. As the senior officer present, it was his responsibility to greet the general and determine what had brought her to his facility unannounced. But as he reached for the door handle, it opened from the outside, and General Hawkins stepped into the room with the confident stride of someone who was comfortable taking charge of any situation. She was smaller in stature than many of the soldiers present, but her presence immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made people stand straighter without conscious thought. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all, General," Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell replied, snapping to attention along with every other soldier in the room. "We were just conducting an informal gathering before our family service ceremony. I'm Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, and these are my operators." General Hawkins nodded, her eyes scanning the room with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent decades evaluating military personnel. Her gaze lingered for a moment on each group of soldiers, noting their bearing, their level of attention, and their general military deportment. "At ease," she said, allowing the soldiers to relax their rigid postures slightly. "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I received some information that required my immediate attention. I understand you have a civilian visitor here today." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell felt his confusion deepen. How could a general officer know about his uncle's presence? And why would it matter? Thomas was just a family member attending a routine ceremony, hardly the kind of situation that would warrant intervention from the highest levels of command. "Yes, General. My uncle is here for our family service recognition event. He's a veteran himself, though he served long before any of us were born." General Hawkins's expression shifted slightly, taking on a quality that the experienced soldiers in the room recognized as the look she got when she was about to deliver news that would change everything. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, I need you to point out your uncle to me." James turned toward the corner where Thomas had been sitting, only to find that his uncle had risen from his chair and was standing at a respectful attention, his weathered hands held loosely at his sides. There was something different about Thomas's posture now, something that suggested military training that ran deeper than the casual bearing most veterans retained years after their service ended. "That would be me, General," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying a tone of respect but not surprise, as if he had been expecting this moment for longer than anyone else in the room. General Hawkins walked directly toward Thomas, and, as she approached, her expression transformed completely. The professional military bearing remained, but it was now mixed with something that looked remarkably like reverence. "Mr. Mitchell," she said when she reached him, or should I say, Master Sergeant Mitchell? The title hit the room like a physical force. Several soldiers exchanged glances, suddenly, realizing that the old civilian they had been mocking was not just a veteran, but a senior non-commissioned officer, someone who had held significant responsibility and earned considerable respect during his military service. But Thomas shook his head slightly. I was never a master sergeant, General. Just did my job and came home. General Hawkins studied his face for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room lean forward to catch every word. Thomas Mitchell, age 72, served 3 tours in Vietnam between 1968 and 1973. Assigned to Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, better known as MACVSOG. Participated in more than 40 cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia. Credited with 11 confirmed enemy kills during a single engagement while carrying wounded teammates to safety. The room had gone completely silent. MACVSOG was legendary among special operations personnel, known for conducting some of the most dangerous and classified missions of the Vietnam War. The soldiers who served with SOG had been the elite of the elite, operating in small teams deep behind enemy lines with minimal support and maximum risk. But General Hawkins wasn't finished. Recommended for the Medal of Honor after Operation Junction City. But the recommendation was classified and buried due to the sensitive nature of the mission. Awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 3 Bronze Stars with V-Device for Valor. All awards remained classified until 2018, when they were finally declassified as part of a historical review process. Each revelation hit the assembled soldiers like a separate blow. The man they had been mocking for his faded tattoo was not just a veteran, but one of the most decorated soldiers of his generation, a warrior whose service record would make any of them proud to claim. Thomas remained standing quietly, neither confirming nor denying the general's words, his expression unchanged from the patient dignity he had maintained throughout the earlier mockery. General Hawkins continued, "What brings me here today, however, is not just Mr. Mitchell's service record, though that alone would warrant considerable respect. I'm here because of a phone call I received this morning from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It seems that Mr. Mitchell has been trying for the past 6 months to get approval for a service-connected disability claim related to injuries sustained during his classified operations." She turned to address the room as a whole, her voice taking on the tone she used when delivering important briefings. The VA has been giving him the runaround because many of his mission reports remain classified, and he couldn't provide documentation to support his claims. The bureaucrats didn't understand that some of our most heroic service members can't prove their service precisely because their operations were too sensitive for normal record-keeping. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell felt the world shift beneath his feet. His uncle, the quiet construction worker who lived in a small apartment and drove a 15-year-old pickup truck, was not just a veteran, but a genuine war hero whose service had been so classified that he couldn't even access his own records to get the medical care he had earned. The phone call I received, General Hawkins continued, was from a VA administrator who wanted to verify whether someone named Thomas Mitchell had actually served with MACVSOG, because his claims seemed too extraordinary to be credible to the desk clerks processing his paperwork. She paused, letting the implications of that statement sink in before continuing. I spent this morning reviewing classified files that most people in this room don't have clearance to access. What I found was a service record that reads like something from a military thriller novel, except it's all documented fact. Thomas Mitchell didn't just serve his country, he bled for it, sacrificed for it, and lost friends for it in ways that most of us can only imagine. The soldiers who had been laughing and joking just minutes before now found themselves struggling to process this revelation. The old man with the faded tattoo wasn't just a veteran. He was living military history, a connection to operations so dangerous and important that they had remained classified for decades after the war ended. General Hawkins turned back to Thomas, her voice softening slightly. "Mr. Mitchell, I want you to know that as of this morning, your disability claim has been approved with full back pay dating to your initial application. More importantly, I want you to know that your service has not been forgotten, even if it couldn't be publicly acknowledged until now." Thomas nodded slightly, his voice barely above a whisper when he replied, "Thank you, General. But I didn't serve for recognition. We all did what needed to be done." The humility in his response only served to highlight the magnitude of what the soldiers in the room had just learned. This man had carried his secrets for more than 50 years, enduring bureaucratic obstacles, and living modestly on construction wages when he should have been receiving full military benefits for service-connected disabilities sustained in combat. As the full weight of the situation settled over the room, The soldiers who had been mocking Thomas's tattoo began to understand that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. They had been privileged to see a genuine hero, not the Hollywood version of heroism, but the real thing, humble and unassuming, carrying his burdens quietly and asking for nothing more than what he had rightfully earned through blood and sacrifice. General Hawkins wasn't finished with her revelations. As the soldiers stood in stunned silence, processing what they had just learned about the man they had been mocking, she moved closer to Thomas and gestured toward his faded tattoo. "Mr. Mitchell, would you mind if I told these soldiers about that particular piece of ink on your arm? I think they might be interested to learn its significance." Thomas looked down at the tattoo, then back at the general, his expression showing the first sign of real emotion he had displayed since entering the room. For a moment, it seemed as if he might decline, but then he nodded slowly. "If you think it would serve some purpose, General." General Hawkins turned to address the assembled soldiers, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a history lesson that would never be found in any textbook. "That tattoo," she said, pointing to the faded marking on Thomas's forearm, "is not some random piece of body art. It's a unit identification marking that was used by members of MACVSOG during some of the most dangerous operations of the Vietnam War. The reason it looks so crude and unprofessional is because it wasn't done in a tattoo parlor. It was done in a bunker in Cambodia, using improvised equipment, while enemy forces were actively searching for the team that included Mr. Mitchell. The room was so quiet that the sound of air conditioning seemed loud. Every soldier was hanging on the general's words, beginning to understand that they were learning about a piece of military history that had been hidden from public view for decades. The tattoo represents membership in what was called the Ghost Squadron, a designation that never appeared in any official records because the unit never officially existed. Members of this group were volunteers who undertook missions so dangerous and so classified that they couldn't be acknowledged even within the military command structure. She paused, studying the faces of the listening soldiers. The ink was mixed with blood from each team member, creating a permanent bond that went beyond military regulations or official recognition. It was a promise that none of them would be left behind, that their service would be remembered by someone even if it could never be publicly acknowledged. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been the first to mock the tattoo, felt his stomach drop as the full implications of the general's words hit him. He had been making jokes about a marking that represented brotherhood forged in combat conditions that made his own deployments look like training exercises. General Hawkins continued, "What makes this particular tattoo even more significant is that Mr. Mitchell is one of only 3 surviving members of the original Ghost Squadron. The others died in operations that were so classified that their families were never told the true circumstances of their deaths. For more than 50 years, Mr. Mitchell has carried the memory of those men alone, unable to share their stories or receive recognition for their sacrifice." Thomas remained standing silently, his eyes focused on something beyond the walls of the room, as if he was seeing faces and places that existed only in his memory. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "We were kids," he said simply. "Bobby Hendricks was 22. Jimmy Santos was 24. Mike O'Connor had just turned 21. They deserved to come home and live the lives they had planned. Instead, they died in a place that doesn't exist on any map, fighting an enemy that was never officially acknowledged, serving a mission that couldn't be discussed even among ourselves." The emotion in his voice was carefully controlled, but it was unmistakable. This was a man who had carried the weight of his fallen comrades for half a century, who had never been able to properly mourn their loss because their deaths couldn't be publicly acknowledged. "The tattoo," Thomas continued, "was Bobby's idea. He said that even if nobody else ever knew what we had done, even if the government buried our service records so deep that they might never see daylight, at least we would carry proof that we had been brothers, that we had served together and looked out for each other when nobody else could." General Hawkins nodded, then addressed the soldiers directly. "I want you to understand something about the kind of operations these men conducted. They were inserted into hostile territory with no backup, no air support, and no possibility of rescue if things went wrong. They gathered intelligence on enemy supply lines, conducted assassination missions against high-value targets, and carried out sabotage operations that influenced the course of entire military campaigns." She gestured toward Thomas. Mr. Mitchell's final mission involved a team insertion into what intelligence believed was a small enemy supply depot. Instead, they found themselves in the middle of a major enemy staging area with more than 200 hostile forces. When the team came under attack, Mr. Mitchell spent 3 days moving his wounded teammates to safety one by one, making multiple trips through enemy-controlled territory while hostile forces closed in around him. The details were staggering to soldiers who understood exactly what such an operation would entail. Moving wounded personnel through hostile territory was dangerous enough with modern equipment, communication systems, and backup support. Doing it alone, in the jungle, with 1970s technology and no possibility of rescue, was almost beyond comprehension. By the time extraction was possible, the general continued, Mr. Mitchell had moved 11 wounded soldiers to a safe location, eliminated more than 30 enemy combatants, and held a defensive position for 6 hours while calling in artillery strikes on enemy positions using a radio with failing batteries. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell looked at his uncle with new eyes, finally, beginning to understand why Thomas had always deflected questions about his military service. It wasn't modesty or discomfort with attention. It was the weight of carrying secrets that could never be shared, of having experiences that couldn't be discussed even with other veterans. The reason Mr. Mitchell never talks about his service, General Hawkins said, as if reading James's thoughts, is not because he's ashamed of it or because it wasn't significant. It's because for 50 years he was legally prohibited from discussing classified operations, and by the time those restrictions were lifted, he had built a life based on privacy and quiet service. She turned back to Thomas. What I want these soldiers to understand, Mr. Mitchell, is that the faded appearance of your tattoo doesn't represent poor craftsmanship or a youthful mistake. It represents time. 50 years of carrying the memory of men who can't speak for themselves. 50 years of living with experiences that shaped you but couldn't be shared. 50 years of quiet dignity while others received recognition for service that, while honorable, couldn't compare to what you and your team accomplished. Thomas nodded slowly, then looked around the room at the faces of the soldiers who had been laughing at his tattoo just minutes before. There was no anger in his expression, no desire for apology or acknowledgement of their mistake. Instead, there was something that looked like understanding and perhaps even compassion for their embarrassment. I don't tell you this to make anyone feel bad, he said, his voice steady and calm. You had no way of knowing. The tattoo does look pretty rough after all these years, and I understand why it would seem like something to joke about. But I want you to understand that sometimes the most important things in a person's life are the things that look the least impressive from the outside. The words carried a weight that went beyond military service or personal history. They spoke to a fundamental truth about human nature, about the danger of making assumptions based on surface appearances, about the importance of treating others with respect even when their stories were unknown. Private Coleman, who had directly asked Thomas about his tattoo earlier, stepped forward slightly. Sir, I owe you an apology. We all do. We had no right to mock something we didn't understand. Thomas shook his head gently. You don't owe me anything, son. You're good soldiers serving your country with honor. That's all any of us can do. But General Hawkins wasn't ready to let the lesson end there. Actually, I think there is something you can learn from this, all of you. Mr. Mitchell represents a generation of warriors who served without recognition, without fanfare, and without the support systems that you take for granted today. They carried burdens that would have broken lesser men, and they did it quietly, without complaint, because that's what service sometimes requires. She gestured around the room. You are the inheritors of a tradition that includes men like Thomas Mitchell. When you wear your uniforms, when you serve your country, when you put yourselves in harm's way for people you've never met, you're continuing a legacy that he and his teammates helped establish. The least you can do is honor that legacy by understanding that heroism doesn't always look like what you expect it to look like. As the general's words sank in, the atmosphere in the room underwent a complete transformation. The casual confidence and easy camaraderie that had characterized the gathering was replaced by a sense of reverence and reflection. These elite soldiers, accustomed to thinking of themselves as the pinnacle of military achievement, had been confronted with evidence of service that exceeded anything in their own experience. More than that, they had been forced to confront their own assumptions about worth, about judgment, and about the stories that every person carries with them. The old man they had dismissed as irrelevant had turned out to be a living connection to military history, a repository of experiences that would never be fully documented or completely understood by anyone who hadn't lived through them. The ceremony that had been scheduled to honor long-serving military families was about to take on a significance that none of them had anticipated when the day began. The silence that followed General Hawkins's revelations was unlike anything the Delta Force operators had ever experienced in their careers. These were men trained to process information quickly, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to maintain their composure under pressure. But nothing in their training had prepared them for the complete reversal of understanding they had just experienced. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to break the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to apologize to you. What we did was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for initiating the comments about your tattoo." Thomas looked at the young sergeant with kind eyes that held no trace of anger or resentment. "Son, you don't need to apologize for being human. We all make assumptions based on what we can see. The important thing is what we do when we learn we were wrong." But Rodriguez wasn't finished. The weight of what he had learned was clearly affecting him deeply. "Sir, my grandfather served in World War II, and I grew up hearing stories about how veterans from that era were treated when they came home. I thought our generation was different, that we understood the value of service better than the people who protested against Vietnam veterans. But what we did today was worse than anything those protesters did, because we're supposed to be brothers in arms." The comparison stung because it was accurate. The soldiers in this room weren't civilians who didn't understand military service. They were professional warriors who had taken an oath to honor those who came before them, and they had failed in that fundamental responsibility through their casual mockery. General Hawkins watched this exchange with the careful attention of someone who understood that this moment represented a crucial learning opportunity for everyone involved. "Sergeant Rodriguez raises an important point," she said. "The military brotherhood is supposed to extend across generations, across conflicts, and across differences in equipment, training, and support. When that brotherhood fails, it's usually because we've allowed ourselves to think that our service is somehow more valuable or more legitimate than the service of those who came before us." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, his own emotions clearly struggling against his professional composure. "Uncle Tom, I had no idea. All these years, I thought you just didn't like talking about your service because it brought back bad memories. I never imagined that you were carrying secrets like this." Thomas smiled slightly, the first genuine smile he had shown since entering the room. "James, your service is just as important as mine. Different, but just as important. You're leading good men in dangerous times, and that's exactly what this country needs. Don't diminish what you do just because my service happened to be classified." But James wasn't ready to accept that easy absolution. "I let my men mock you. I could have stopped it, and I didn't. I was embarrassed to have you here because I thought you didn't understand our world, when the truth is that you understand it better than any of us." The pain in his voice was evident to everyone in the room. This was a man who prided himself on taking care of his soldiers and honoring military traditions, and he had failed in both responsibilities simultaneously. General Hawkins intervened before the conversation could spiral into a cycle of guilt and recrimination. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, what happened here today wasn't a failure of leadership. It was a learning opportunity that presented itself in an unexpected way. The question now is what we do with what we've learned." She turned to address the entire room. "I didn't come here to embarrass anyone or to make you feel guilty about your assumptions. I came here because Thomas Mitchell represents something that the modern military sometimes forgets: the importance of quiet service, of carrying burdens without complaint, and of maintaining dignity in the face of adversity." Private Coleman, who had been standing silently since his earlier apology, stepped forward again. "General, is there anything we can do? Some way to honor Mr. Mitchell's service or the service of his teammates who didn't come home?" The question surprised Thomas, who looked at the young soldier with new interest. "Son, you don't need to do anything special for me. But if you want to honor Bobby, Jimmy, and Mike, then be the kind of soldiers they would have been proud to serve alongside." General Hawkins nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right. The best way to honor previous generations of warriors is to embody the values they fought to defend: integrity, courage, sacrifice, and respect for others, regardless of how they might appear on the surface." Corporal Walsh, who had participated enthusiastically in the earlier mockery, asked a question that several others had been thinking. "Mr. Mitchell, how do you do it? How do you carry something like that for 50 years without becoming bitter or angry?" Thomas considered the question carefully before answering. "You find purpose in something bigger than your pain. For me, that was building things. Bridges, houses, schools. Every time I finished a construction project, I could see something concrete that made people's lives better. It wasn't the same as serving in the military, but it was service nonetheless." He paused, looking around the room at the faces of these young warriors. You also learn that bitterness is a choice. I could have spent 50 years being angry about the friends I lost, about the recognition that never came, about the bureaucrats who made my life difficult when I tried to get medical care. But what would that have accomplished? Bobby, Jimmy, and Mike are still dead. The missions are still classified. The only thing that would have changed is that I would have wasted 50 years being miserable instead of finding ways to be useful. The profound simplicity of his philosophy hit the assembled soldiers like a physical force. Here was a man who had legitimate reasons to be angry, to feel victimized by circumstances beyond his control, to demand special treatment or recognition for his service. Instead, he had chosen to live quietly, to find meaning in civilian work, and to treat others with kindness even when they didn't extend the same courtesy to him. General Hawkins checked her watch, realizing that the scheduled ceremony was supposed to have begun several minutes ago. But what was happening in this room was more important than any formal program could have been. "I think," she said, "that we should proceed with today's ceremony, but with some modifications to the program. Mr. Mitchell, would you be willing to participate in a brief recognition of your service? Nothing that would compromise classified information, but something that would allow these soldiers to properly honor what you've done." Thomas shook his head gently. "General, I appreciate the offer, but that's not necessary. These young people have already given me something more valuable than any formal recognition." "What's that?" asked Sergeant Martinez. "They've reminded me that the Brotherhood continues, that the values Bobby, Jimmy, and Mike died for are still alive in soldiers like you. That's worth more than any medal or ceremony could ever be." But the soldiers weren't ready to let the moment pass without some form of acknowledgement. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez spoke for the group when he said, "Mr. Mitchell, would you at least allow us to learn from you? Would you be willing to share some of the lessons you learned, some of the wisdom you gained from your experiences?" Thomas looked around the room, seeing something in these faces that reminded him of his own youth, of the eager intensity he had brought to his own military service decades earlier. "I can tell you this," he said finally. "The most important thing you can learn is that everyone you meet is carrying something. You can't always see it, and they might not talk about it, but everyone has burdens, everyone has stories, everyone has value that goes beyond what you can observe on the surface." He gestured toward his faded tattoo. "This ink has been mocked, questioned, and dismissed more times than I can count over the years. But it's also been a reminder to me that the most meaningful things in life are often the things that look the least impressive to other people. Your job as soldiers, and as human beings, is to treat others with respect even when you don't understand their story." The ceremony that followed was unlike any military recognition event that any of the participants had ever attended. Instead of focusing on official achievements and formal accomplishments, it became a meditation on service, sacrifice, and the bonds that connect warriors across generations and conflicts. When Thomas finally left the base that afternoon, he carried with him something he hadn't possessed in decades: the knowledge that his service had been acknowledged not just by official records and government bureaucrats, but by the men who would carry the tradition forward into the future. And the Delta Force operators who had mocked his tattoo that morning went home with a new understanding of what it meant to serve with honor, to judge others with wisdom, and to recognize that heroism often comes in forms that don't match our expectations. In the weeks that followed, the story of Thomas Mitchell and his faded tattoo would become part of the informal curriculum at Fort Bragg, a reminder to young soldiers that the most important lessons about military service often come from the most unexpected sources. And somewhere in a small apartment across town, an old construction worker would continue his quiet life, secure in the knowledge that the brotherhood he had served was in good hands with the next generation of warriors. The tattoo remained as faded as ever, but its meaning had been restored to the light where it belonged.